The email hit my inbox at 8:42. Mandatory town hall. Immediate attendance. No agenda. No sender name. That alone was enough to sour my coffee. Welcome to the channel. Before listening to today's story, could you tell me what the temperature is where you live? If you continue listening, please leave your lucky number for me to know. I was sitting in the middle row when the room filled paper cups, half-open laptops, the low hum of people trying not to look worried. I'm Lena Ross, a mid-level manager, not flashy, not loud, the kind of person executives forget exists until they need something fixed quietly. Then Victor Hale walked in. Tailored suit, easy smile, the confidence of someone who had never waited for approval in his life. "I've been placed here," he said, voice smooth, rehearsed. As a special leadership assignment from the CEO's office, no logo on the slide behind him, no authorization footer, just his name. He talked about efficiency, about cutting dead weight, about moving fast and not apologizing. Each word landed like a warning disguised as strategy. 5 minutes in, he stopped talking. His finger came up and locked onto Caleb Wright. Caleb sat 2 seats to my left. Senior analyst, quiet, brilliant, the kind of employee who fixes disasters at midnight and never gets credit for it. "You," Victor said. "Pack up. HR will walk you out today. No warning, no review, no discussion." Caleb didn't move, his face drained of color. Around us, the room went perfectly silent, like everyone had learned. At the same time, how expensive breathing could be. I watched Victor give an order without a single document to back it up. I watched HR nod and comply without asking a question. I watched my colleagues stare at their screens. Suddenly, very busy. Very innocent. So this is how he plans to rule. I thought. Caleb was escorted out. The door closed. The meeting ended as if nothing had happened. As people filed past me, Victor's gaze finally found mine. He paused. Just for a second. Because I hadn't reacted. And that more than any argument clearly bothered him. What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. I stayed in my chair after Caleb was escorted out. The door closed softly, which somehow made it worse. No one said his name. No one followed. Screens lit back up, keyboards resumed, and the office pretended this was normal. I opened my laptop and pulled up my employment contract, page by page, clause by clause, not because I was afraid, but because fear makes people sloppy, and I refused to be sloppy. Termination authority, delegation limits, required signatures. I read slowly, deliberately, letting the noise of the office fade into static. Across the floor, Victor Hale was already acting like the furniture belonged to him. He ordered HR to initiate a department restructure. Those were his words. Restructure. A word executives love because it sounds clean while it cuts deep. People whispered. A manager near the windows quietly asked who would be next. No one answered. Emails started flying. Calendar holds disappeared. Meetings were canceled without explanation. The kind of chaos that looks accidental, but never is. I kept working. I answered messages. I finished a report that had been due before any of this started. Silence, I reminded myself, is a form of discipline. When the office finally thinned out, I switched documents. Caleb's contract, same company, same template, same clauses. That was when something stopped me cold. Victor could recommend termination. He could pressure HR. He could posture in front of a room, but he could not legally execute a dismissal without written delegation from the CEO. And there was none. No authorization memo, no temporary appointment clause, no emergency powers, nothing that gave him the right to end Caleb's employment on the spot. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled for the first time that day. Caleb hadn't been fired. Not yet. Victor thought my silence meant fear. In reality, it meant calculation and calculations. When done correctly, always change the outcome. That mattered more today. The week after Caleb was removed, the office didn't recover, it adjusted. That was worse. Fear settled in quietly. Like stale air, you only notice when it becomes hard to breathe. Victor Hale didn't shout. He didn't need to. He managed through uncertainty. And uncertainty does most of the work for people like him. On Monday morning, Victor announced new performance standards. He called them dynamic KPIs. No definitions, no benchmarks, just shifting targets that changed depending on who was asking. One day, speed mattered. The next, accuracy. By Thursday, attitude appeared as a metric. Someone asked for clarification. Victor smiled and said, "If you need it, explained. You're already behind." By Tuesday, emails began arriving after midnight. Short messages, no greetings, no context. Review this. Why isn't this done? Explain. People started checking their phones in bed. I watched the glow of screens reflected in tired faces during morning stand-ups. Exhaustion. I learned is a very efficient management tool. Friday brought the rankings. Victor projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. Names listed from top to bottom. No explanation of methodology. No appeal process. Just a public hierarchy. The top 5 were praised for being aligned. The bottom 3 were labeled at risk. No one laughed. No one spoke. Chairs creaked as people adjusted their posture, trying to look useful. The same names kept floating upward. The same people nodded at Victor's jokes, laughed half a second too early, agreed before he finished speaking. They stayed late, not to work, but to be seen. They survived. The rest learned to disappear. Meetings changed tone. Questions vanished. Presentations became rehearsed affirmations. I watched capable people shrink, recalculating every sentence before they spoke. Fear turned professionals into actors, all reading from the same invisible script. I stayed silent, not invisible, silent. I took notes the way I always do. Dates, times, phrases, the language Victor favored, low trust, disruptive energy, culture mismatch, words that sound clinical until they're written next to a name. When someone asked about Caleb, Victor waved it off. Legacy issue, he said. We're moving forward. That was his answer to everything. Forward. As if direction alone made something right. By the second week, people stopped asking questions entirely. Meetings became performances. Everyone agreed. Everyone complied. The office felt smaller, even though nothing physical had changed. Fear compresses space. I reviewed my own output carefully. Deadlines met. Metrics exceeded. Feedback non-existent. Silence, in this environment, didn't mean safety. It meant you hadn't been noticed yet. I noticed how praise was rationed like currency. A quick nod in the hallway meant survival for another week. A delayed reply meant danger. HR stopped offering guidance and started offering silence. Their desks became checkpoints instead of resources. People whispered about resumes, recruiters, exit plans, all while pretending to focus on spreadsheets. The building looked the same, but it no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a test you could fail without knowing the questions. Late one afternoon, I received a calendar invite. No title, just Victor and HR. 15 minutes. I didn't rush. I finished my work, closed my laptop, and walked to the conference room on time. Victor was already there. Arms crossed, HR seated beside him with a folder open. Victor smiled thinly. We're reviewing behavioral alignment, he said. Some concerns have come up. I nodded once and sat down. I had seen this pattern before, just never this close. Control disguised as leadership, anxiety sold as motivation. It was crude, but effective, especially on people who still believed fairness was guaranteed. That was when I understood the system completely. And unlike most of them, I was no longer guessing. I was measuring, comparing, and waiting for the moment the numbers stopped lying. and the silence sharpened. "You've been here long enough to understand how this works," he continued. "We're building a culture of accountability. People who resist alignment tend to struggle." "Alignment isn't listed in my performance metrics," I said. HR shifted slightly. The only sign of life from her side of the table. "This isn't about metrics," Victor said. "It's about behavior." Behavior! The word landed exactly where he intended it to: vague, flexible, dangerous. I leaned back in my chair. "Then I assume this conversation is documented." Victor's eyes flicked to the folder. HR didn't answer. "This is an informal discussion," he said. "Consider it guidance. Guidance delivered behind closed doors. Without witnesses, without paper." I noted the structure. I noted the absence of process. Most of all, I noted his confidence that none of it would be challenged. "You've been unusually quiet," Victor went on. "That can be interpreted in different ways." "I work," I said. "That takes time." He laughed softly. "Work is visible when it matters. So is authority," I said. That earned me another look. This one sharper. Victor stepped closer to the table. "You should be careful," he said. "People who question leadership often discover how replaceable they are." "I've reviewed my contract," I answered. "Replacement isn't immediate." The room tightened. HR's pen stopped moving. Victor straightened. "We're evaluating your long-term fit," he said. "HR will be reviewing your behavioral record." There it was, not a threat. A decision framed as procedure. I nodded once. "Then I trust the review will follow policy." He watched me for a moment, calculating. He had expected fear, maybe anger. Instead, he was getting compliance without submission, and it unsettled him. "Anything else?" I asked. Victor waved a hand. "That will be all." I stood and left without waiting for dismissal. The hallway outside felt colder, quieter, like the building itself had exhaled. Conversations resumed only after I passed. No one asked what had been said. They didn't want to know. Back at my desk, I documented the meeting while it was still fresh. Time, language, posture, intent, silence, when recorded properly, becomes evidence. Victor believed eye contact established dominance. He believed proximity created pressure. What he didn't understand was that by naming me as a problem, he had made me a variable, and variables get tested. When the email arrived an hour later, copying HR, announcing a formal review of my behavior and organizational alignment, I felt no surprise. Only confirmation. Victor had chosen his next target. And by doing so, he had moved the conflict from instinct to process, from impulse to structure. That was a mistake he would not recognize until much later. I knew the rules now, and rules favor patience over ego, especially when someone mistakes authority for inheritance alone eventually. If you agree that staying silent, documenting everything, and letting the process expose him was the right move, leave a 1 in the comments. Your opinion matters. Because collective voices are what turn quiet restraint into real accountability. Isolation didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in, slow and deliberate, the way cold settles into concrete after sunset. The morning after Victor announced his team player incentives, the office felt rearranged without moving a single wall. An all-hands email went out before 9. Spot bonuses, restricted stock units, priority project assignments. Victor framed it as gratitude for those who showed alignment during a critical transition. The message was short, polished, and carefully vague. Names were not listed, but everyone knew who had made the cut. I wasn't one of them. By noon, the changes were visible. Desks clustered closer together, quiet laughter near the windows. A Slack channel I had contributed to for 2 years disappeared from my sidebar. Meeting invites stopped arriving, not canceled, simply absent. As if I had never been necessary to begin with. No one said anything to me directly. That was the sharpest part. Isolation in a corporate office isn't enforced through confrontation. It's enforced through omission. People who used to ask for my input now sent summaries instead. People who once sat beside me during lunch found other tables. other conversations, other reasons to be busy. I kept working. I delivered every assignment ahead of schedule. I answered emails within minutes. I documented decisions no one had asked me to make. The system still recognized my credentials, and as long as it did, I would remain visible to it, even if the people around me pretended otherwise. Victor walked past my desk twice that afternoon. He didn't stop. He didn't look. That was intentional. Attention, I was learning, was now a reward, not a given. Approval had become currency, and silence was its opposite. The bitterness didn't come from losing access. It came from watching how quickly others adapted. People I respected recalibrated their loyalty overnight. They laughed at Victor's jokes. They repeated his phrases. Alignment, momentum, right-sizing. Language shifted first. Behavior followed. By the third day, HR stopped responding to my questions. Polite acknowledgments replaced answers. We'll circle back. Noted. Thanks for flagging. Each response felt automated, stripped of responsibility. The distance was no longer subtle, it was procedural. I noticed my name missing from a document review I had authored. I noticed decisions referencing data I had provided. Discussed in meetings I was not invited to attend. Credit moved without me. Authority did too. The office grew smaller, hallways narrowed, conversations lowered when I approached. Even the coffee machine felt hostile, a place where silence stretched just long enough to remind me I was alone. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself isolation was a tactic, not a verdict. Still, there was a bitterness that came from being erased slowly, deliberately, by people who knew better and chose convenience anyway. Late Friday afternoon, when most of the floor had already left, an email appeared on my calendar. 15 minutes. HR and Victor. No subject, no explanation. I stared at it longer than I wanted to admit. The isolation had reached its conclusion. Victor wasn't just removing me from conversations anymore. He was preparing to remove me entirely. I didn't accept the invite right away. I let it sit, unread, while the office lights dimmed and the cleaning crew rolled their carts past my desk. Isolation had stripped away conversation, but it had clarified intent. This wasn't about performance or culture. It was about visibility and control. Victor needed silence around him, not competence beneath him. As I finally clicked accept, I understood the sequence. First exclusion, then erasure, then termination, framed as inevitability. The bitterness hardened into resolve. Being isolated hurt, but it also simplified the board. When people stop pretending you belong, they stop hiding their moves, and that, I knew, would matter in the room waiting for me. I stayed seated, breathing slowly, already preparing for the conversation that would officially try to end my place there inside. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, when the floor was quiet and decisions could pass unnoticed. I arrived on time. Victor was already standing, coat draped over a chair, as if he planned to leave quickly. HR sat beside him, hands folded, expression neutral to the point of absence. Victor didn't waste time. He didn't circle the table or lean into ambiguity. He looked at me and said, "Effective immediately." That was it. 2 words. No justification. No paper. No warning delivered with concern. Just finality, spoken like a privilege he believed he owned. For a moment, the room tilted, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that shock doesn't announce itself with noise. It tightens your chest and waits to see if you will beg. I didn't. I sat still, my hands resting on my lap, my breathing even. I had expected anger. I had prepared for humiliation. What arrived instead was a cold, precise clarity. "Where is the CEO's signature?" I asked. Victor blinked. Once, it was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You're done here," he said. "HR will handle the details. I'm asking about authorization," I replied. "Termination requires written delegation." HR's eyes dropped to the table. Victor's jaw tightened. He reached for his coat. "This conversation is over," he said. And then he left. The door closed behind him, not slammed, just closed. As if this were a routine administrative task. HR remained seated for a moment longer. Avoiding my gaze. "You'll receive next steps by email," she said finally. I nodded. I stood. I walked back to my desk without rushing. Without stopping to explain anything to anyone. A few heads turned. No one spoke. Shock, I learned, has a way of spreading silently through open space. At my desk. I logged in. The system accepted my credentials without hesitation. Email loaded. Internal tools opened. Project dashboards populated exactly as they had that morning. No access revoked. No warnings triggered. No automated exit protocol initiated. I checked again. Still active. I closed my eyes briefly. Not in relief, but in confirmation. Victor had moved too fast. He had acted on impulse, not process. He had assumed authority where none had been granted. And the system, indifferent to ego, reflected that truth. I drafted a short note to myself. Time, words, sequence, who was present, what was said, what was missing, around me. The office resumed its low hum. Printer's word. A phone rang. Life continued. Unaware that something fundamental had just misfired. An email arrived from HR. Polite, vague. "We will be reviewing documentation. No mention of signatures." I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled up Caleb's file again. His termination notice. The same gaps. The same assumptions. 2 firings executed without authority, relying on fear to finish the job. The shock lingered. But it didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. Being fired without process isn't an ending. It's a procedural error waiting to be corrected. As the sun dipped below the buildings outside, I shut down my computer properly, logged out, and stood. My badge still worked at the elevator. The doors opened without resistance. On my way out, I passed Victor in the lobby. He didn't look at me. He was already on his phone, already moving on. I stepped into the evening air and finally allowed myself a single breath. He thought he had erased me. He hadn't even closed the system. I walked the block slowly, letting the city absorb the shock for me. The restraint held, heavy but intact. Tonight was not for speeches or calls. Tonight was for accuracy. Victor believed speed was strength. He believed endings were declared, not validated. He believed fear would do the paperwork he refused to read. By morning, the records would still show me inside, active, accountable. That discrepancy mattered. It meant the story was not over. It meant the system, quietly and faithfully, had kept a door open he never knew existed. I waited until I was home to make the call, not because I was afraid, but because some conversations don't belong in hallways or parking garages. The apartment was quiet, the city muffled by glass and height. I set my phone on the table, stared at the screen, and let the silence stretch until my breathing slowed. I hadn't called my father in years. We had an agreement, unspoken but firm. I would build my own record. He would stay out of it. Tonight wasn't about breaking that boundary. It was about reporting a failure. When he answered, there were no pleasantries. "Go ahead," he said. Victor's voice still echoed in my head, effective immediately. I ignored it and spoke carefully. "The way you do when facts matter more than emotion. I was terminated today without authorization." I said, "So was Caleb Wright last week. There was no interruption, no questions yet, just listening." I continued, "No written delegation, no emergency appointment. HR acted without verifying authority. 2 terminations executed outside policy." A pause. I pictured him at his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Who initiated it?" he asked. "Victor Hale?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "He's been operating under assumed authority." I said, "Restructures, incentives, public rankings, fear-based management. None of it documented properly." I could hear him breathe out slowly, not anger, Calculation. I'm not asking you to intervene. I added. I'm documenting a risk. You were fired, he said. Announced. I corrected, not processed. My access is still active. That did it. The silence sharpened. Email timestamps, he asked. I have them. Witnesses, yes. HR, present, every time. I leaned back in my chair, the tension easing into something steadier. This wasn't a plea, it was a briefing. There's more. I said. Victor has begun reviewing my behavioral record. Pretext for removal. Another breath. Longer. Send nothing, he said. Say nothing. I haven't. Good. I waited. This was the moment where he could have said he'd handle it personally. He didn't, instead. He asked, Is anyone else at risk? Yes. I said, Everyone who didn't align. The word tasted bitter. I see, he said. The call lasted less than 8 minutes. When it ended, I felt lighter, not because I'd been rescued, but because the record was complete. Silence had done its job. Now accuracy would do the rest. I didn't sleep much. I didn't need to. By morning, the office buzzed differently. Messages stalled, meetings paused, attention I hadn't felt before crept in. Subtle but unmistakable. At 9:23, an internal notice appeared. No subject line, no sender name. HR to report to department immediately. I read it twice. Around me, people looked up from their screens. Confused. Victor's office door remained closed. I stayed seated. The call hadn't saved me. It had changed the board. And when HR stepped onto the floor 15 minutes later, faces tight and folders in hand, I knew the turn had already begun. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No announcement, no apology, no explanation. That was the point. Power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves through administrative steps and unanswered questions. Victor remained absent, and that absence spoke louder than his speeches ever had. People began recalculating their tone, their posture, their assumptions. HR didn't look at anyone directly. They moved with purpose. But without confidence, I recognized the shift immediately. Fear had changed direction. It was no longer flowing down. It was pooling upward. I didn't smile. I didn't stand. I kept working, exactly as I had before. Because the reversal wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And procedures, once triggered, don't stop because someone believes they should. That understanding settled in quietly, steady and irreversible, as I watched the department hold its breath, unaware that the outcome had already shifted beyond Victor's control and into systems he had never bothered to understand. At last, permanently, there. HR arrived without ceremony. No speech, no apology, no explanation for the delay. They stood at the front of the floor, folders closed, expressions neutral. As if neutrality itself could erase what had happened, the room gathered slowly, chairs scraping, conversations dying mid-sentence. Victor appeared last, confident, composed, already preparing a smile. The senior HR director cleared her throat. We've completed a preliminary review, she said. 2 actions require immediate correction. She didn't look at Victor when she spoke. First, she continued, the termination of Caleb Wright is void. The required authorization was not present. His employment status is fully reinstated, effective immediately. The air shifted. A sound moved through the room. Not quite relief, not quite disbelief. Someone exhaled sharply. Caleb wasn't there to hear it, but the absence felt lighter anyway. Second, the director said, pausing just long enough. The attempted termination of Lena Ross was executed outside delegated authority. That action is invalid. I felt it then, not triumph, not relief. Something colder, precise. Victor laughed once. Too quickly. That's not accurate, he said. I was acting on executive direction. The director met his eyes for the first time. We found no record of such direction. Silence fell hard. Victor's smile thinned. He glanced around the room, searching for agreement, for recognition, for loyalty that would not arrive. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "We'll resolve it privately." "No," the director replied. "This is a correction." She turned to the room. "All employment decisions are suspended pending further review. No additional actions are authorized." Victor's face tightened. The posture he had worn so comfortably began to collapse under its own weight. Authority, I learned, looks different when it is revoked in public. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The reversal wasn't personal. It was administrative. And that made it cleaner. HR dispersed as quickly as they had arrived. Conversations resumed cautiously. Recalibrated. People looked at me, then away, unsure which version of reality applied now. Victor remained standing, unmoving, when he finally spoke. His voice was controlled, but the edges had frayed. "We'll discuss next steps," he said. To no one in particular. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop. Everything still worked. Access unchanged, permissions intact. The system had never believed him. An email followed within minutes, carefully worded, announcing temporary adjustments and ongoing review. It named no names. It didn't have to. By afternoon, the shift was unmistakable. People who had avoided me now nodded, tentative, curious. The same managers who had echoed Victor's language suddenly discovered caution. Fear had moved again, this time sideways. Victor didn't speak to me. He didn't need to. I could feel his attention, sharp and searching, like a hand hovering just short of contact. He had lost the floor, but not his interest. Late in the day, I noticed him watching me from across the office, eyes narrowed, head tilted, studying me as if I were a document he hadn't read closely enough. He didn't see an employee anymore. He saw an anomaly that night. As I packed my bag, I understood the twist of it. The reversal had answered one question and raised another. Victor no longer needed to remove me. He needed to know who I was and why the system had chosen me over him. That curiosity would drive his next move, and for the first time, I welcomed it. Nothing else was said. But everything had changed. Power had shifted from speeches to files, from tone to timestamps. I left the building knowing Victor would not accept this quietly. He would search, dig, cross lines he didn't understand. He would look for leverage, for a story that explained the failure, and in that search, he would expose himself far more than he ever intended. That realization followed me home, steady and calm, like a promise I hadn't made aloud yet fully. Panic does not announce itself with noise. It leaks through behavior, through rushed decisions and glances that linger too long. After the reversal, Victor Hale began unraveling in small, visible ways. His confidence fractured into vigilance, his charm into suspicion. I noticed it immediately, not because he confessed it, but because fear always changes how people move when they believe the room is watching. The first mistake came quietly. Victor requested a background verification through internal channels. Disguised as a compliance check, he didn't announce it. He didn't authorize it properly. He simply assumed access would obey him. Instead, it stalled, flagged, and left a trail. Systems are patient, but they are not forgiving when someone touches what they should not. By midweek, the whispers started. Victor learned that my personnel file contained no family references, no emergency contacts beyond a generic legal proxy, no legacy data linking me to anyone important, to him. That absence felt like deception. He didn't consider discretion. He considered threat. The lack of explanation unsettled him more than any explanation could have. The second discovery rattled him harder. Certain systems still responded to my credentials with elevated tolerance. Audit logs opened. Historical dashboards remained visible. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, but enough to make him uncomfortable. He asked IT for answers. They gave him none. Access patterns, they said, followed authorization chains. His name did not appear in them. I watched him spiral from a distance. Emails sent too quickly, meetings called without purpose, Questions phrased as accusations. The man who once relied on fear to manage now feared what he could not classify. Panic stripped him of patience. And without patience, his decisions began to bleed into error, instead of slowing down. Victor escalated. He demanded reports that did not exist and approvals that had never been granted. He began naming himself in conversations as if repetition alone could create legitimacy. I heard him say it once in the hallway, too loudly, too quickly, as if daring reality to challenge him. The panic peaked when external partners entered the picture. Victor scheduled a client briefing without clearance, positioning himself at the center of it. He spoke about continuity, about vision, about inheritance. I wasn't in the room, but the message traveled fast, distorted and dangerous. By claiming what he did not yet have, Victor crossed into visible desperation. He introduced himself as the future of the company, as if saying it aloud would make it true. That was his worst mistake. Panic doesn't just reveal fear, it creates witnesses. When I heard what he had said, I understood the shift completely. Victor was no longer trying to remove me quietly. He was trying to outrun the truth. Panic had pushed him from calculation into performance, and performances collapse when the audience knows the script is false. I stayed where I was, silent, watching the consequences form. Victor's panic was no longer subtle, and it would not remain contained. By declaring himself before outsiders, he had invited scrutiny he could not control. Systems would answer questions people could not. Records would surface. Timelines would align. Panic had loosened his grip on strategy, and in doing so, it handed me something invaluable: predictability. I didn't need to act yet. I only needed to let his fear keep talking, because every claim he made without authority built the case he thought he was avoiding. The mask had slipped, and everyone outside our walls had seen it. That, I knew, would change what came next. He believed exposure would crown him. Instead, it marked him. Panic had rewritten his instincts, turning caution into arrogance and speed into recklessness. I felt no urgency, only a quiet certainty. When someone announces power too soon, they reveal its absence. Victor had stepped into the open, waving a title he did not own. From that moment forward, the outcome was no longer a question of if, but when. And in that waiting space, his panic would keep making choices for him. All I had to do was watch and remember everything carefully. The event was supposed to be routine, the kind of polished corporate gathering designed to reassure partners and investors that everything was stable. Glass walls, catered food, familiar logos projected on clean screens. I arrived early, not because I was eager, but because patterns reveal themselves best before the performance begins. Victor arrived surrounded by people who had learned which side of him was safest to stand on. He moved through the room like he owned it, shaking hands, smiling too widely, already speaking in futures he did not possess. I stayed near the back, unnoticed, listening. The presentation began with familiar language. Vision, continuity, confidence. Victor stepped forward and introduced himself as if the title belonged to him already. As the future leader of this company, he said, without hesitation, without correction. There was a pause. Not the awkward kind. The kind that happens when someone with actual authority decides to speak. A board member cleared his throat. "That's not accurate," he said calmly. Heads turned. The correction did not come from me. "It didn't need to." Another voice followed, measured and precise. "Lena Ross is the CEO's only legal child." Someone said, "She has never held a public title by choice." The room froze. Victor's face drained of color as the implication landed. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. He opened his mouth, then closed it. As if the words had abandoned him, it continued. Because truth rarely stops at convenience. "Victor Hale," the voice said, "has no succession rights. His relationship to the CEO does not confer authority." The sentence settled like a verdict. Victor tried to laugh it off. "This is inappropriate." he said sharply. "We can discuss family matters privately." But no one moved. The moment had passed that option. I didn't step forward. I didn't need to. My silence had done its work. People looked at me differently now, not with sympathy, but with recalculation. Authority, real authority, had just been reassigned without my consent. Victor left the stage early. He didn't look at me as he passed. By then, he already understood the damage. This wasn't gossip, it was record, and records travel fast. By morning, the office would know, emails would circulate, questions would follow. Victor's declaration had escaped the room, carrying consequences with it. Public truth has momentum, and it doesn't wait for permission. I walked out into the night feeling neither victorious nor afraid. Exposure had finished what fear started. The mask was gone, and everyone had seen what lay underneath. The twist revealed itself quietly. Before dawn, messages began to arrive. Internal channels buzzed with questions Victor could not answer. The story had returned to the building faster than he ever had. I knew what would come next. Investigations do not care about intent. They care about claims and proof. Victor had offered one publicly, and now it belonged to everyone. As I left the venue, my phone vibrated again. Another internal alert. Another recalculation happening without him. The reveal was complete, and the aftermath had already begun. Tomorrow, the office would look the same: desks, screens, meetings. But the hierarchy had collapsed in plain sight. Victor had named himself too soon, and in doing so, he had handed the truth a microphone. I walked away, knowing the story would be retold before sunrise. Reshaped, but undeniable. By the time the lights came on at the office, nothing he claimed would sound the same again. That certainty followed me home, steady and unshakable. As the city blurred past, exposure had shifted the narrative permanently, and no amount of denial could reverse it now. By morning, the company would be forced to respond, not to him, but to facts already in motion. Consequences were already moving, irreversible, far beyond Victor's control. Chaos doesn't erupt all at once. It fractures. After the public reveal, Victor moved through the office like a man chasing echoes of himself, trying to outrun a story that no longer belonged to him. Phones rang without answers. Meetings dissolved into arguments. The order he once commanded slipped into noise. First came blame. Victor gathered managers and spoke fast. Pointing outward, I was misled. He said, HR failed. Legal dropped the ball. Names were offered like shields. No one accepted them. People took notes instead. Blame, when witnessed, turns into record. And records travel. Then came the pleas. He stopped me in the hallway, voice lowered, eyes rimmed red. You know this went too far, he said. We can fix it quietly. He promised stability, offered concessions, hinted at favors that once might have mattered. I didn't respond. Silence has weight when desperation presses against it. The pleas curdled into bargaining sessions no one agreed to attend. Victor proposed task forces, town halls, resets. He spoke of unity while drafting excuses. He asked for time while burning it. The floor watched, alert now, measuring him the way he once measured everyone else. By afternoon, the tone hardened. Emails arrived stamped urgent, threaded with legal language. Defamation. One read, breach of duty, said another. He CC'd attorneys I'd never heard of, hoping volume could substitute for authority. It didn't. Threats. Stripped of leverage. Read like confessions. I didn't argue. I didn't counter-threaten. I initiated procedure. From my desk, I submitted a formal request to trigger an internal audit. Scope unauthorized personnel actions. Misrepresentation of authority. Improper access attempts. Attachments, timestamps. Emails. Witness lists. I clicked submit and watched the confirmation populate. Systems prefer facts. They don't flinch. The building felt unstable after that. Victor paced. He demanded meetings that no one scheduled. He sent messages that went unanswered. He tried charm again, then anger, then charm once more. Each swing exposed the same truth power had left him, and he couldn't accept the silence that followed. He cornered me near the elevators as the audit notice circulated. "If you do this," he said, "I'll sue." His voice cracked on the word. "I'll make this ugly. It's already documented." I replied, "That's what audits are for." He stared at me as if waiting for regret. None came. The audit moved quickly. Access logs surfaced. Delegation gaps widened. His earlier curiosity about my file now returned as evidence against him. Panic makes fingerprints. He had left many, and they connected cleanly. Late evening. Security protocols updated automatically. Permissions revalidated. Authority trees pruned. The system didn't announce it. But everyone felt it. Victor's approvals stopped propagating. His emails lost priority. Calendars declined him without explanation. Even his badge pauses became noticeable. He sent one last message to the floor. "Stand down," it read. No one did. The final notice arrived after sunset. Short, precise. All operational privileges associated with Victor Hale are suspended pending investigation. No drama, no signature flourish. Just fact. I closed my laptop and exhaled. Not relief. Resolution. Victor's office light went dark. The noise faded. What remained was process doing what process does when someone mistakes fear for control. Tomorrow would bring questions, hearings, outcomes. Tonight marked the end of his resistance. He had tried blame, then begging, then threats. None of it stopped the machinery he had activated himself. I gathered my things and left. The building steady again. Desperation collapses when it meets procedure. And procedures, once triggered, do not care who is shouting anymore. I stepped into the night knowing resistance had burned itself out. Order returns not with applause, but with constraints. What followed would be slow, deliberate, unavoidable. Victor had exhausted every move except acceptance. And the system, patient and exacting, had already chosen what came next. That certainty steadied me. It always does when noise finally ends. Completely. Decisively. Justice rarely arrives with applause. It comes quietly. Documented. Unavoidable. By the time the board meeting ended, Victor Hale was no longer an executive. No longer an exception. No longer protected by noise. The vote was brief. His employment was terminated for cause. An external investigation was authorized. Legal counsel outlined next steps without emotion. I watched from my seat, hands folded, listening to procedure finish what fear could not. Victor did not argue. He did not plead. He stared at the table as if the grain might offer an exit when the chair asked for questions. He said nothing. Silence had finally reached him. The investigation moved fast. Access logs, emails, delegations, timelines. Each finding narrowed the room. Prosecutors followed the trail the audit had drawn. Charges were filed, not for ambition, but for misrepresentation and abuse of authority. Accountability, it turns out, has a very specific vocabulary. Caleb returned the following week. HR restored his role, his pay, his record. Then they promoted him. Publicly, without flourish. When he shook my hand, he smiled once and said, "I stayed." It was enough. Leadership transitioned without drama. I was appointed interim, then confirmed. No speech, no banner. I signed the policies I had once memorized and reopened meetings that welcomed questions again. The office breathed differently. Work resumed on my first morning. I walked the floor alone. Desks looked the same. People looked steadier. Systems responded exactly as designed. That was the point. I did not celebrate. Justice is not a victory lap. It is the restoration of rules. Calm returned because process held. Calendars stabilized. Budgets unlocked. People asked questions without glancing at doors. I answered plainly and listened longer. Trust rebuilt through minutes, not speeches. Each decision cited policy. Each exception documented. Nothing dramatic, just consistent fairness. That consistency is what endures when personalities pass and titles change. Measured leadership favors patience, transparency, accountability, learning, repair, continuity, humility, care, and durable results over spectacle always. As I closed my notebook, I wrote the last line I would keep. He thought silence meant weakness. It was actually restraint. I didn't tell this story to prove that silence is always the right answer, or that power will eventually collapse on its own. What I learned is this: how you respond in a moment of injustice shapes who you become afterward. I could have raised my voice. I could have reacted immediately. Instead, I chose to observe, to document, and to protect the truth in its original form. Not because I was weak, but because I understood that emotional outbursts often help the wrong people hide their mistakes faster. Maybe you've been in a room where something was clearly unfair and no one spoke up. Maybe you've asked yourself, if it were me, what would I do? Would you stay quiet to survive? Or act in a way that lets you live with yourself later? There's no single right answer for everyone. But one thing I believe deeply is this: dignity is always worth defending, even when it's done quietly. If you're listening to this right now, tell me, where are you listening from? At home, on your commute, or during a quiet moment that belongs only to you? Every response represents a real person thinking, and that matters more than you might realize. If this story resonated with you, your subscription isn't just a number. It helps stories like this travel farther. It helps someone who's stuck in silence realize they're not alone. A like, a comment, or a share could be the reason someone else finds the courage to think differently, to act differently. And sometimes, that's the most meaningful thing you can do today. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.